Last time I pointed out how the DSM-4 task force clearly acknowledged the shortcomings of the DSM-3 in their own justification for the fourth edition. How those who developed the third edition relied on expert opinion over implementing any scientific methodology. This, despite all the claims during development and immediately following publication about how the DSM-3 would or did scientifically solve the problem of diagnostic reliability. As a reminder, it was the APA, or the American Psychological Association, who made this diagnostic reliability psychiatry's central issue, when criticism of the mental health industry was at its highest. The developers of the DSM-4 in turn presented the lack of scientific methodology in the development of the DSM-3 as a problem they would solve by requiring high standards after the fact to making any changes to that same third edition in the making of DSM-4. You will later hear this referenced as a conservative approach. And to reiterate, this matches what Kirk and Cutchins wrote in their article, The Myth of the Reliability of DSM, just prior to the publication of the DSM-4. The scientific integrity of the revision process cannot be assessed until long after a revised DSM is published. By then, the next revision is underway, and criticisms of the last revision appears petty or irrelevant or both. But unless past claims by proponents of DSM are scrutinized in light of the scientific evidence that was used at the time, we are unable to evaluate the extent to which science and systematic evidence support the process of continual revision. And as I last left off, the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, is not only used to diagnose clients or patients, but is also used as the basis for research on treatments for those same diagnoses. In short, it all comes back to the DSM, and from all appearances, any issues with one edition of the manual persist through the continual revision process. But next, I am going to look at criticisms of the DSM-5 and its development from none other than Alan Francis, the chair of the DSM-4 task force. Wither DSM-5 from 2009. Well before the formal start of work on DSM-5 in 2007, the American Psychiatric Association, with support from the National Institute of Mental Health, attempted to develop a research agenda that would support the development of a classification system in psychiatry based on biological markers. The goal was a bold one, to promote research that might replace our superficial, descriptive method of diagnosis with one based on etiological understanding. There was a series of 12 research planning conferences, each of which reviewed the literature in a given diagnostic area. One important focus was to determine whether there was sufficient evidence to allow for the inclusion of biological tests for any of the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria sets. Not surprisingly, the disappointing conclusion of all this effort was that there are no biological markers even remotely ready for inclusion in DSM-5. The good news is that the remarkable revolutions in neuroscience, molecular biology, and genetics of the past 3 decades have given us great insights into the functioning of the normal brain. The bad news is that our understanding of psychopathology is fairly primitive and may remain so for some time. It appears that normal brains tend to be normal in more or less the same way, while the causes of psychopathology are likely to be wildly and heterogeneously complex. Although there have been many tantalizing putative biological findings for particular disorders, all reflect no more than group mean differences, and none has achieved anything close to the needed sensitivity and specificity to qualify as a diagnostic test. Thus, it is obvious that our field lacks the fundamental understanding of pathogenesis that will be required before we can take the next meaningful step forward towards a paradigm-shifting etiological model of diagnosis. With the lack of any proper evidence to develop a classification system in psychiatry based on biological markers, was a revision of the 4th edition of the DSM put on hold? Of course not. Again from Alan Francis, from The Professional Counselor, Volume 4, Issue 3, Special Issue Counseling and the DSM-5 from 2014. DSM, Psychotherapy, Counseling, and the Medicalization of Mental Illness, a commentary from Alan Francis. First, addressing the DSM-3. In addition to its considerable impact on the mental health profession, the DSM-3 also significantly affected the pharmaceutical industry. Drug companies benefited greatly from the DSM-3 approach, particularly since 1987, when Prozac established the template for promoting blockbuster psychiatric drugs. Pharma realized that the best way to sell pills is to promote disease-mongering. Their marketing campaign offers the misleading idea that mental disorders are underdiagnosed, easy to diagnose due to chemical imbalances in the brain, and best treated with a pill. The marketing targeted psychiatrists first, then primary care physicians, and, since 1997, the general public. In the United States and New Zealand, drug companies have successfully bullied the government into allowing direct advertising to consumers on television, in print, and on the internet. Use of medication has skyrocketed as a result of these billion-dollar marketing budgets, turning us into a pill-popping society. This increase in drug use is great for pharma shareholders and executives, but often inappropriate for clients and terribly costly to the economy. More than $40 billion a year are spent on psychiatric drugs. Most of these, 80%, are prescribed by primary care doctors with little training or interest in psychiatric diagnosis or treatment, while under strong pressure from patients and drug company representatives, and after only 7 minutes of evaluation on average. And do take notice of the emphasis that it is primary care doctors, not psychiatrists, who are under strong pressure from drug company representatives. Moving on to the DSM-4, Francis writes, "In preparing DSM-4, we attempted to hold the line against diagnostic inflation and the medicalization of normality. However, we failed. During the past 20 years, the United States has experienced fad epidemics of ADHD, autism, and bipolar disorder. We were conservative in writing the DSM-4. Conservative, as I have already discussed, by putting the scientific burden on making changes, despite full knowledge of the shortcomings of the third edition. We were conservative in writing the DSM-4, but failed to anticipate or prevent its careless misuse under external pressure." Under external pressure, this is a key point here, particularly drug company marketing and the requirement of psychiatric diagnosis for clients to qualify for school services and disability benefits. The quick fix is to give a diagnosis, but often this does more harm than good in the long run. Inaccurate diagnoses are easy to give, but hard to remove. Often they haunt the client for life with stigma, unnecessary treatments, and reduced expectations. Making an accurate diagnosis requires really knowing one's client, which may take weeks or even months. In uncertain situations, it is better to underdiagnose than overdiagnose a symptom pattern, and better to be safe than sorry. The DSM-5 will considerably increase medicalization and may turn our current diagnostic inflation into hyperinflation. Overdiagnosis transforms normal grief into major depressive disorder, normal temper tantrums into disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, normal forgetfulness of old age into minor neurocognitive disorder, poor eating habits into binge eating disorder, and expectable worry about physical symptoms into somatic symptom disorder. It also further loosens the already far too slack criteria for attention deficit disorder and contains a completely confusing definition of autism. Experience teaches that whenever the diagnostic spigot is unrestricted, drug company revenues increase, and less funding is available to support psychotherapy and counseling visits. The DSM is only one guide to diagnosis. It is not a Bible or official manual of diagnosis. The DSM codes that clinicians routinely use for reimbursement are in fact all International Classification of Diseases Clinical Modification, or ICD-CM. Codes that are available for free on the internet. DSM-5 is one suggested way to arrive at an ICD-CM diagnosis, but it is not the only or best way. Other more reliable guides to psychiatric diagnosis are available. Therapists do not have to buy or use the DSM-5 unless they work for an institution that requires it. And here, of course, it would be nice to know which, if any, institutions do not require the DSM and in its most up-to-date form. Receiving a psychiatric diagnosis can be a turning point in a client's life. An accurate diagnosis can lead to an effective treatment plan. An inaccurate diagnosis can lead to side effects, stigma, high costs, reduced opportunities, and needless suffering. Severe and classic presentations require quick diagnosis and immediate intervention, usually including medication. Milder, equivocal presentations allow for and require a more cautious approach. Therefore, watchful waiting or brief counseling is usually best. And with all of the criticisms here about pharmaceutical companies, I want to point to another article. But as an aside, I want to focus on the idea that pharma realized that the best way to sell pills is to promote disease mongering. Their marketing campaign offers the misleading idea that mental disorders are underdiagnosed, easy to diagnose due to chemical imbalances in the brain, and best treated with a pill. Despite all the finger-pointing at primary care physicians, psychiatrists themselves have historically used this chemical imbalance idea to sell Prozac, other SSRIs, and other psychotropics to clients and patients, and possibly still do to this day, and only after 7 minutes of evaluation on average. Despite all of the denial surrounding this idea, I can even personally attest to the fact that the chemical imbalance narrative is still taught to psychology students to this day as something useful to use in treatment. It is untrue, inaccurate, false, but it is still taught as useful nonetheless. Moving on, however, I wanted to read from the article, Industry's Colonization of Psychiatry, Ethical and Practical Implications of Financial Conflicts of Interest in the DSM-5, by Lisa Cosgrove and Emily E. Wheeler. This is from the publication Feminism and Psychology from 2013, but these issues are also addressed in the book Psychiatry Under the Influence, Institutional Corruption, Social Injury, and Prescriptions for Reform by Robert Whitaker and Lisa Cosgrove. The article here neatly sums up points from several research articles from Cosgrove and others. The concern that industry might affect psychiatric taxonomy was heightened when it was discovered that the American Psychiatric Association receives substantial drug industry funding and that most of the individuals who serve as diagnostic panel members also have drug industry ties. In 2006, it was reported that 100% of the individuals on 2 DSM panels, schizophrenia and psychotic disorders and mood disorders, had financial ties. For example, served on speaker bureaus, corporate boards, or received honoraria with industry. The fact that all of the members of these panels had industry ties is problematic because psychopharmacology is the standard treatment in these 2 categories of disorders. The APA, to its credit, has instituted a mandatory disclosure policy. All DSM-5 panel members are required to post financial disclosure statements, and the APA has made a comment to better manage potential financial conflicts of interest. This new disclosure requirement appeared promising, and one may have expected to see a decrease in the number of individuals serving on the DSM-5 panel who have corporate ties. Despite increased transparency, industry relationships with DSM panel members persist. Of the DSM-5 task force members who oversee the development of the manual, 69% reported having ties to the pharmaceutical industry. This represents an increase of 21% over the portion of DSM-4 task force members with such ties. Moreover, it is not only task force members who have financial relationships with big pharma. 58% of the DSM-5 panel members, the individuals who serve in specialized groups tasked with making the revisions, reported financial relationships. Hardly an improvement over the 56% of DSM-4 members who were found to have such industry relationships. Most of the DSM-5 panels still have the majority of members with industry ties. It is also noteworthy that, as with the DSM-4, the panels with the highest number of members with financial conflicts of interests are those for which pharmacological treatment is the first-line intervention. The type and level of financial relationships also needs to be spelled out more clearly. The APA's disclosure policy does not require DSM panel members to report their participation on pharmaceutical companies, advisory boards, or speakers' bureaus. This is a glaring omission in that it is widely recognized that speakers' bureau participation constitutes a significant financial conflict of interest and is usually prohibited, for example, for faculty in medical schools. In fact, pharmaceutical companies refer to these individuals as key opinion leaders, or KOLs, because they are seen as essential to the marketing of diseases as well as drugs. In a recent article, Cosgrove and Krimsky reported that 15% of the DSM-5 panel members disclosed elsewhere that they participated on speakers' bureaus and/or scientific advisory boards, indicating that these particular relationships exist with some frequency despite the lack of explicit acknowledgement in the disclosure statements.
Some of this is, I think, the result of commercial forces.
So with all of the hand-wringing over the pharmaceutical industry's influence on psychiatry in relation to external pressure or the DSM-5, through these conflicts of interest, it seems obvious that the DSM-4 was developed with a clear and significant presence of conflicts of interest with internal pressure from the same pharmaceutical industries directly under Francis's watch. Here, journalist Robert Whitaker, in his book Anatomy of an Epidemic, Magic Bullets, Psychiatric Drugs and the Astonishing Rise of Mental Illness in America, is also helpful in explaining how the development of the partnership between the American Psychiatric Association and the pharmaceutical industry first developed. The financial interest of pharmaceutical companies and physicians became closely aligned in 1951 when Congress gave doctors their monopolistic prescribing privileges. But in the 1980s, the APA and the industry took this relationship one step further and essentially entered into a drug marketing partnership. The APA and psychiatrists at academic medical centers served as the frontmen in this arrangement. The seed for this partnership was planted in 1974 when the APA formed a task force to assess the importance of pharmaceutical support for its future. This was only 1 year removed from the APA's appointment of Robert Spitzer as the head of the DSM-3 task force. The answer was very, and in 1980 that led the APA to institute a policy change of transformative importance. Up to that time, pharmaceutical companies had regularly put up fancy exhibits at the APA's annual meeting and paid for social events, but they hadn't been allowed to put on scientific talks. However, in 1980, the APA's board of directors voted to allow pharmaceutical companies to start sponsoring scientific symposiums at its annual meeting. The drug firms paid the APA a fee for this privilege, and soon the most well-attended events at its annual meeting were the industry-funded symposiums, which provided the attendees with a sumptuous meal and featured presentations by a panel of experts. The speakers were paid handsomely to give the talks, and the drug companies made certain that their presentations went off without a hitch. The door to a full-fledged partnership had been flung open, one that would sell the medical model and the benefits of psychiatric medications to the public, and the APA now began to regularly rely on pharmaceutical money to fund many of its activities. The drug companies began endowing continuing education programs and psychiatric grand rounds at hospitals, and, as one psychiatrist observed, the companies were happy to cap them with free food and booze to sweeten the love of learning. When the APA launched a political action committee in 1982 to lobby Congress, this effort was funded by pharma. The industry helped pay for the APA's media training workshops. In 1985, APA Secretary Fred Gottlieb observed that the APA was now receiving millions of dollars of drug house money each year. 2 years later, an issue of the APA's newsletter, Psychiatric News, featured a photo of Smith, Kline, and French, which is now part of the British group GSK, handing a check to APA President Robert Pasnow, which led one reader to quip that the APA had become the American Psychopharmaceutical Association. The APA was prospering financially now, with its revenues jumping from $10.5 million in 1980 to $21.4 million in 1987, and it settled into a fancy new building in Washington, D.C. It openly talked about our partners in industry. And to return to Alan Francis and his book, Saving Normal, I have been tireless in exposing the weak spots and harms of psychiatry, after a long career observing the errors made by others, and also making my own share of mistakes. I know the weaknesses and limitations of the field perhaps as well as anyone, but I also know how helpful psychiatry can be. During my 40-year career, I have seen many dozens of patients badly harmed by psychiatric care and many hundred not helped by it one bit. But I have also seen many thousands for whom accurate diagnosis and effective treatment have been essential to a good life, sometimes a lifesaver. And I have witnessed the shameful tragedy of 1 million psychiatric patients imprisoned for minor nuisance crimes committed because they had no access to treatment in the community and no decent place to sleep at night. We mustn't ignore the warnings of those who are critical of and or feel harmed by psychiatry. They goad us appropriately to higher standards of practice and to greater caution, humility, and specificity of care. But the crisis of confidence caused by DSM-5 should not detract from the value of psychiatry nor blind us to its necessity.
People who are essentially normal.
Francis, in the process of heading the DSM-4 task force, criticized the lack of any scientific methodology in the previous revision process on the third edition, of which he was also a part, while also placing any scientific burden of proof on implementing any changes to the DSM-3 when developing the DSM-4. Years after the fact, he has emphasized how he was conservative in his approach by, in fact, making few changes at all. Looking at the development of both of these editions, this appears like nothing short of a charade, with Francis playing a key role. Given how Francis also tiptoes around the fact that conflicts of interest ties to the pharmaceutical industry existed, and to a significant extent, on his own task force. And who knows how much these ties influenced those changes that were made to the DSM-3 in the development of the DSM-4. By pointing the finger at other revision teams or other sets of professionals, such as primary care physicians. Given all of this, Francis has absolutely no moral high ground on which to stand to defend his own profession. I have seen dozens badly harmed, many hundreds not helped, but many thousands for who accurate diagnosis and effective treatment have been essential to a good life, sometimes a lifesaver. The article, Why Ineffective Psychotherapies Appear to Work, as I have consistently referenced, offers numerous reasons not to trust anecdotal evidence when it comes to claims about diagnosis and treatment, either from a clinician or client. Francis here echoes the sentiments of psychiatrist Theo Dorpat in his book Gaslighting, the Double Whammy, Interrogation, and Other Methods of Covert Control in Psychotherapy and Analysis. Though I shall in this book frequently discuss the damaging psychic effects of covert methods of interpersonal control, or namely, how psychotherapists control and manipulate their clients, I believe we should exercise some restraint in criticizing mental health professionals and other persons who use these directive methods. Most often they do not consciously intend to injure others, and most often because of the group denial, they are unaware of what they are doing and of the psychic effects of what they are doing. In short, we may do harm and plenty of it, but we do so much good too, so don't you dare criticize our profession. Or, I can criticize psychiatry or the mental health industry, you can't. This seems to be the consistent message even when it comes to professionals willing to address some of the problems surrounding the mental health industry. And before digging into a sample diagnosis from the DSM and surrounding controversies, next time I will look in depth at another article, this time from a social work perspective on the DSM-5. I hope to see you there.